Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Henry Neufeld. I'm the owner of Energion Publications, and I'm talking today with Dr. Allan Bevere. He's a retired United Methodist pastor. Although I've never met a pastor who actually retired. We'll see how that goes for him. And he's also an Energion author of several books. Probably most relevant for today is his book, The Politics of Witness, which he has been available for some time. I've talked to a lot of pastors recently who talk about the problem of politics from the pulpit, and they also stories of churches that are getting divided over, particularly in this case, American politics. And I've heard a lot of, how shall I say, treating the symptoms, as in what you don't talk about, what you do talk about, how you talk about things. I'd rather go back to this question is, as a minister of the gospel, how is it that you should address the social issues, the political issues that surround the church?
Yeah, Henry, thanks for having me. Well, as a way to introduce that, one of the main points of that little book I wrote, and someday I'd like to actually write an expansion of it, and is that it's not a question of whether or not the church will be political. The church is political. The church is a polity. It is a politic. The question is how it will be political. And my opinion is that the church is primarily political through just being the church, through its witness, by living out the gospel in the community it is in. And the problem has been when the church primarily thinks that being involved in politics is to lobby Washington, D.C., or be Republicans or Democrats. And what we do is we get ourselves entangled in a system that has a dark underbelly, and we end up being co-opted. Our gospel ends up sounding more like the RNC or the DNC and not enough like the church. So to boil that down, the way I say it is, when most Christians hear the word politics, they think nation. I want Christians to hear the word politics and think church. Church and its mission, church in its everything that it does in mission to the community of loving God and loving neighbor.
Okay, so when you say living the church as a community, living in witness, in what way do we portray who we are to the world?
Yeah, one of the things that we do is we are generous with feeding the poor, and we say to the powers that be, you'd be a better state if you took care of the poor too. Now, there certainly can be reasonable discussion about how best to do that. Obviously, reasonable people can disagree. But we show by our witness what God expects of the world. I'll give you an example from the 19th century. Prior to the Civil War, when slavery, of course, was being hotly argued and debated, the Quaker church made a decision that they could not be a witness to the nation of the evils of slavery as long as Quakers owned slaves. And so what they said was, if you want to be a Quaker, you must not have slaves, which actually increased the membership of the Episcopalian Church in several states, because some slave-owning Quakers didn't want to give up their slaves. But the point was, they said, we cannot be a witness to what God expects if we are not living it out. So that's the position that I am taking, that we show the world by our life and witness what God expects of the nations.
Okay, so as a matter of clarification here, you're talking about both advocacy for issues, advocacy for candidates. Any of this is subjected to being primarily the witness.
Yeah, it's primarily the witness. Now, I would say that I'm not suggesting that there is no place for what I'm going to call a position of activism, advocating, writing letters to Congress, that kind of thing. What has bothered me is that I think the job description has gotten reversed, and that we think the church is most effective when it's picketing and protesting and lobbying politicians. Where I want to say is the church is most effective when it is just doing its job, which, by the way, has political implications. It shouldn't be lost on us that in the book of Acts, the church often finds themselves on the wrong side of the authorities, not because they're telling the authorities what to do, but because they're just living and preaching the gospel. And so we need to get back to that idea of embodying God's politic for the world by our witness, and then hopefully the larger powers come to see that there is something required of them too. That it's important to note that when you look at the prophets of the Old Testament, most of their prophetic message was directed to God's people, Israel, and after the split of the kingdom, Israel and Judah. But you do have prophets. You have story of Jonah going to Nineveh. You have Amos in the beginning of his proclamation denouncing different nations for what they did. So God does have expectations for the nations of the world, but primarily God's message is aimed at the church. Discipleship is for disciples. The Sermon on the Mount is for disciples. And I dare say if we, the church, really try to embody the Sermon on the Mount, we might get noticed by those who are keeping an eye on us.
That's an interesting thing, because we're dealing with the influence. And I was just in a study today where we were discussing 1 Corinthians 6 and brother going to law against brother, and that goes back to the Sermon on the Mount, which with the turning the other cheek and so on and so forth. And you asked this, the question immediately came to my mind, as I'm a member of a United Methodist congregation. You're a retired United Methodist pastor, as we have now churches suing effectively one another through the organization. And it's hard for me to say, okay, you're right, you're wrong on, on the issues of this, but we can't say that that's a good witness,
right,
to church doing that. And that's my concern. Do you have how do we talk about this, and what can we do to improve the church's witness under these kinds of circumstances?
Yeah. Well, if you're talking directly about what's going on in Florida with the lawsuits going on, I'm a firm believer that there has been dismal failure on both sides of the human sexuality issue in the United Methodist Church. It's gotten so raucous and so bitter that, of course, each side is accusing the other side of shenanigans and dishonesty, when actually I think there's probably been enough to go around. And so what I see is a breakdown in mediation, and also both sides really wanting what is best for the witness of the gospel, and therefore, how do we do this thing? How do we, if there's going to be a separation, which I have publicly said not only will happen, but it needs to happen because the differences are irreconcilable. What is it that has failed that we feel now we have to resort to the court system in order to do that? It is not a good witness. I think right now the church has a witness problem when it comes to politics. I think one of the jobs of a pastor is to help the congregation navigate the tensions that are in the church and that are impinge upon the church as a result of being in a particular culture or society. And so it isn't that pastors can't have opinions on human sexuality or what other issues, but they have to understand that they've got people in their churches that are on different sides of different issues. And it seems to me the job of the pastor is to help navigate those tensions. The job of the pastor is to provide space for people to have what I like to call courageous conversations, and not avoid conversations. But you need to provide it in a forum where there can be conversation. I'm not, unless you've got, and there are examples of activist churches that I would, like evangelical churches where everybody who goes there is pro-life on abortion, or liberal churches where everyone who goes there believes in the right to marriage equality. But with those exceptions, most congregations are diverse. And so the job of the pastor is to help, not to say all positions are created equal and all views are created equal, but We are in disagreement, so we need to provide space for the conversation. I'm not so sure a sermon is a good vehicle to preach on a controversial issue, unless you announce it ahead of time and you provide spaces afterward for conversation. I've tried to, I will talk about issues. I've talked about issues, general social issues from the pulpit, such as poverty and other things like that. But I'm really careful not to get too specific, because I just don't think the pulpit is the place for that, because you end up feeling like you're being lectured to. And I don't think it works. I think it backfires.
Okay, so the conversation is a very important word to me, because one of the slogans I've used for Energia Publications is publishing for the conversation.
Yeah.
Which is to say that we need to, I think I've told you before that I've been accused, actually regarding the same book, of being a fundamentalist and having gone off the liberal left edge all over the same book.
Yeah. Yeah, I've a couple times in the past published a blog post, and the one I'll never forget was in the same day I got an email from two different people commenting on the same blog post. One telling me my liberal colors had appeared, and the other one told me that I revealed my conservatism in no uncertain terms. And it was the same post. So yeah, that's another issue for another time, I suppose. But I think conversation matters, and I always tell people I'm a big fan of good coffee and good conversation. And so for example, before I retired from the church I served, we had, and they were all Zoom meetings, but we had what we called courageous conversations. And one was on human sexuality over a book that was being read. I led one, a co-led one on immigration, and we had one on racism. And this was a place we said, look, this is online. If you don't have to participate if you don't want, but this is a place for people with diverse views to come and let's have the talk. Let's have the conversation. And we're not having this conversation necessarily to change anybody's mind, but what we hope comes out of it is we have a better understanding of the other, right? And so maybe that will lead to less name calling and insulting. I may not agree with you, Henry, on this issue or that issue, but at least after talking with you, I know where you're coming from. And I understand the reasons why you take the position you do. And so that's what we did. And I thought those were very helpful. And by the way, I think the church has to have those conversations. The other problem with the church is we do one of two things. We either get so in bed with the political powers, whether they're progressive or conservative, that we undermine our witness, or we're so afraid to talk about the issues that the church should care about that we just ignore it. Where you have, and I've had people say to me in previous churches, I go to church to get away from that. I don't want to hear about that. To which I always say is, look, if the church can't help put this stuff in context, because we believe Jesus is Lord and is providing redemption to the world, if the church can't have these conversations, who can? So we go to those two extremes, and I think we got to somewhere err in the middle.
And so you're definitely not telling Christians not to be involved in politics,
no,
and yet also not telling the church not to be involved. You're talking about how to
yes,
be.
exactly right. So one of the things I suggest in my little book, Politics of Witness, that I know will never happen, okay, but I threw it out there as a way to illustrate my point. I suggested that, before you're a pastor, you have to demonstrate you have a call to ministry, right? Whether you're in a denomination or you're not, you have to demonstrate God has called you. I said, what would happen if church members who were felt called to the political arena, what if they had to go before the church to demonstrate they've been called to it, right? I think that's an important issue. It would be saying, if you're going to do this, and you're going to be and realize you're going to be hobnobbing and rubbing shoulders with some unsavory characters, because politics draws money and power, right? Always draws the underbelly of bad elements. We need to make sure you're one of to go back to an old Eliot Ness term, one of the untouchables. We need to make sure that you can be a witness for the gospel in the midst of that. I would be fine with that. Now, that's a long way to say, I think it's fine to vote. I vote. By the way, I know that there are some Christians who don't vote on principle. I don't have a problem with that. We are citizens of another kingdom, and we shouldn't turn voting into a fetish. And some Christians have done that. But vote if you don't like something that's happened, and you need to call your senator, or you need to write a letter, or if you want to make a clear position that you have, that you think that the government would be better if they understood that. I think that's fine. What I think we need to be careful about, I think we need to make sure we don't turn our politics into religion. And I think that's what I'm seeing a lot right now. Politics being turned into religion, and the politics being displayed in all of its splendor in worship, which I think becomes idolatry, because worship's about God. And a lot of times we can turn worship into about us and our pet issues, or about the things that we hold dear. And I think we need to be careful about that.
Okay, so there would be a point there, I would guess, that the church might make use of experts in other areas where the church wants to have influence. That would include things like bioethics, politics. One of my observations has been a lot of religious church resolutions on political issues show the signs of having been written by people who haven't studied it.
Absolutely right. You and I are on the same page. I can't tell you, over the years, sitting in annual conferences, listening to resolutions, and just shaking my head, not because that the resolution in and of itself may not be a bad thing, but it's very clear that they don't understand the complexities of the problem. And so the church needs to, one of the things I've said about being a pastor is, one of the things about being a pastor is you recognize your gifts. You also recognize your limitations, because no pastor can be gifted in everything. And if there's one thing I am not gifted in, is finance, right? It's not something I actually care about, to be honest. I'm a big picture guy. And I have to tell you, I find finance committee meetings to be about the most boring thing you could ever develop. Now, here's the thing. As a pastor, that's not my gift, but I know it's important. I know church finance is important. So what have I done in every church I've served? I find the finance people. I find the people who are good at this. I find the people who know what they're talking about. And I consult them always. And this is what the church needs to do. And so if you're talking about an environmental issue that we're concerned about, if we're talking about any social issue, you name it, we need to find people who are on the ground dealing with this stuff and know the complexities of it, instead of making these broad, what we think are prophetic statements, where we end up actually looking kind of silly at the end of the day. We need to draw more from those folks. And by the way, they're in the church. They're in the church.
I think that's an important, we, like every member in ministry, we have a number of slogans for it, but probably one of the key pastoral skills would be, as you said, recognizing your limitations and passing things off to the people who can in all of these areas. I've commented before, and I bet you'll agree, that one of the most ungodly things in the church is the pastor's job description.
Oh yeah. The pastor's job description is the one thing that I have told seminary students when I teach them and I talk about being a pastor. I said, you will rarely find anybody who thinks the pastor can do everything. But what you will find is people will not like it when they think the pastor is neglecting their thing. If the pastor neglects something that's not important to them, that's okay. But if you're neglecting my thing, it's a problem. So what ends up resulting is a congregation in general does actually functionally think the pastor does everything. And it's and it is an issue. And so one of the things, by the way, that pastors need to do is develop leadership, which we have not done. We've not been good at that, I would say. But we have to recognize our limitations, and therefore find the people who are able to do what we can't do, or what we've struggled to do, because they're part of assisting in the ministry of the church.
I recall serving during a pastoral change where I'd worked with first pastor for multiple years, and then was moving in with the incoming pastor, and received a complaint that the new pastor wasn't mowing the church lawn. And the reason was that the previous pastor, for him, that was very relaxing. So he would get out there at like 6 o'clock in the morning and mow the lawn. And it was one of the times when he did his thinking and whatever. And so the church became accustomed to this and felt that it was the pastor's job to keep the church lawn.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing how those things get embedded. My first little church I served when I was a student pastor was a little part-time church. And I was single. I was single but engaged when I first went to the church. I got married while I was there, the 3 years I was there. And it was really funny because a woman came up to me after service one day and she said, "Oh, I'm so excited that you're going to get married. And, you know, when your wife gets here, she can play the piano because our previous pastor's wife played the piano." And I looked at her and said, "Well, my wife doesn't play the piano. I mean, she's pretty good on the flute." It never dawned on her that a pastor spouse might not play the piano, right? So it is kind of difficult. Yeah, but to sort of get back to the conversation in some respect, I think pastors need to find a way to be tactfully prophetic. You know, the one thing about being a pastor as opposed to a prophet, a traveling evangelist, is you get to go in, if you're the evangelist, the revival preacher, and shake it all up, and you know, you get to have a theological and social food fight with people, and then you get to leave. But when you're a pastor, you're there, and so you have to build relationships. So it doesn't mean that you never speak the difficult word, but you have to be tactful in how you approach it. Reinhold Niebuhr, his journal, Leaves from the Notebook of a Tamed Cynic, which is actually my favorite Reinhold Niebuhr book, because I wasn't a fan of Niebuhr's projects either earlier or later, but I loved this book. It's recollections of when he was a young pastor in the 1930s in Detroit. And he's got a passage in there where he says, you know, there are people who say that pastors don't speak difficult truths because they're too timid. He said, I don't think that's true. He said, I think pastors struggle to speak the difficult truth because it's hard to speak harsh words to people you've come to love. And I think that's true. We need to find a way to speak those words when we have to, but do it with tact and love and grace. And by the way, that can only happen with a pastor who builds relationships with people who are sitting in the pews on Sunday morning.
Well, I'm known as the king of the rabbit trail, and that may appear to have been a rabbit trail.
Oh, that's right. No, I mean, I like trails.
I was doing that intentionally, simply because I think we think of this too much as the pastor's issue.
Yeah.
In other words, this is a message that needs to go to the entire church, because, you know, it's the very same sort of thing that's happening when you expect the pastor to mow the church lawn or the pastor's wife to play the piano.
Yeah.
The same thing's going on, is that the church is not the pastor. The pastor has a huge amount to say about how the church is going to go, but the church is not the pastor. So our discussion here is not just for pastors.
Yeah.
It is for, you know, for everybody in the church. What is the congregation's expectation of their pastor? And I'd like to bring you to comment on that. How would you suggest church members address and work with their pastor to help their pastor do some of the things you've been discussing? What should church members be thinking about?
Well, I think the first thing is you got to have a lot of conversation, because I think a lot of these conversations, a lot haven't really happened, or they've happened very superficially. So you need to provide space for that. I think the other thing that a pastor does is that a pastor always has supporters in their congregation who are what I refer to and others refer to as high capacity people. These are people who are gifted, they have a lot of energy, and they're committed to the church, and they love the church, and they know that the church succeeds when the pastor succeeds. You need to find 2 or 3 of those people and help them, and then ask them to help you promote the continued conversation and participate. Because if the people think it's only the pastor's thing, there's going to be more resistance. When people know that it's not just the pastor, but that there are others who think this is important, you have more people willing to get on board. So I would say first have the conversation. I would also say then that church folks need to let the pastor be a person, just like they are. You know, I had people in my last church very involved in the pro-life movement on abortion. I had other people who not so much. I had people who have very strong opinions on human sexuality one way or another, others not so much. They have to allow the pastor to have certain things that they care about, right? So, you have to allow the pastor to have things that concern them, Mission has always concerned me. It's always been a passion of mine, teaching mission overseas. I'm allowed to have that. I'm allowed to have that passion and see it through, just like people have other things that they work with. So the pastor is not a neutral bystander. The pastor has convictions and views just like everybody else. We don't, it's like when I've had a big presence on social media for a while. A lot of pastors have gotten themselves in trouble on social media. And what I say to pastors is, first of all, if you're going to be controversial on social media, try to be tactful. I don't always live up to that, but try to be tactful. The second thing is, you just tell your congregations, my social media is my social media. I talk about things that are controversial. And if you don't want to know, don't follow me. Plain and simple. Because I don't think it's fair to say to pastors, you can't have that. You can't have that. But pastors have to be, as I say, tactfully prophetic.
That line, tactfully prophetic, is probably going to stick around.
Good.
Yeah.
Good.
Being tactfully prophetic is one of those, because I recall somebody, because I run this, how much do I give of my own opinions versus what I publish? And people are concerned that I publish books that I would agree with.
Right.
Which I do.
Yeah.
And I think you end up with that same kind of thing. And I recall a minister, he was actually a Unitarian minister, Unitarian Universalist minister, said to me, he said, it is very difficult to be both a prophet and a facilitator.
Yes, it is. It is.
You're actually asking pastors to do that.
But the reality is that there are certain times when people will look to the pastor. I think of after 9/11. I think of the Sunday after 9/11. People were looking to the church. They were looking to pastors to say something. They were looking for a word. So I think it is a tough position to be tactfully prophetic. But I think at times that's what we've drawn in reference to our ministries. And, the prophetic is hard because I've also written on the idea that we judge a prophet all too often by whether or not we agree with them. And so if I preach a dynamic sermon on an important issue, people who agreed with me will tell me that that's prophetic. How prophetic? Nobody ever says, I disagree with everything she says. What a prophet. So we tend to judge the prophetic on whether or not I agree with the word. And one of the things we find in the Old Testament is the people chased after the false prophets and rejected the true ones. And, it's no different today. So we need to be careful about using the term prophetic. We need to be careful about deciding who's prophetic. I think prophetic that designation probably only comes in hindsight because, as Jesus rightly says, prophets aren't honored in their own time. I think all of us would consider Martin Luther King Jr. as a prophet, a prophetic voice in the 60s. But boy, he wasn't considered that during his life.
I recall people in the North Georgia town where I lived cheering when he was assassinated.
Yeah, so and no doubt, some of the same people went to church and put money in the plate, right?
Yeah.
And so I think sometimes you can only judge the prophetic in hindsight, but the prophetic exists. It's there. We don't reject that it exists. We just have to be careful. I need to ask myself, why have I decided this person has a prophetic voice? Is it because what they say is the uncomfortable truth, or is it that they confirm what I believe and therefore they're prophetic? So it's a tough thing. I don't have any criteria for making that determination.
I have a book of my own called When People Speak for God that I put in a chapter. What are you going to do when people say, I've got the word from God? How is it that you figure it out? Not that I think I had the answer, because I don't know that there is one single answer there. But anyway, That would be a good topic for a future talk. I'll give you a chance here if you have concluding words. But I think with our tactfully prophetic, we've got a good solid short phrase. Isn't that what the 21st century is about? Getting your 2 or 3 words?
Yeah, something like that. Well, I'm a retired pastor now, so I don't have to be as tactful as I used to be,
So any concluding thoughts before we
Yeah,
close out?
I would say the church in America, when it comes to politics, needs a real reset. I don't know that it's possible because I think we have been endemically enmeshed in the systems of the world for 1700 years. And so that's tough, but I think we need a reset. I think we need a step back. I think Christians can vote Democratic. I think they can vote Republican. I think they can vote independent. I think, but I think that we need to take a step back and realize that the kingdoms of the world are not the kingdoms of God, do not represent the kingdom of God, and that the kingdom of God calls us to a different kind of citizenship that is not from this world. That doesn't mean that it's an entirely spiritual kingdom. That's a misinterpretation of Jesus. But that it does not originate from this world and therefore has a different set of criteria and a different mode of operation in which Jesus himself models through his teaching, his way of life, and finally his submission to the cross. That one of the things we need to focus more on when it comes to the cross is we talk an awful lot about what the cross means for what God has done for us. That's good. We need to talk more about what the cross means for how we are to live in the world, because Jesus presents the example of how to live in the world. Jesus tells us to take up our crosses. I think after 2,000 years, we are still wrestling with that, not sure how to get our hands around it.
Okay, and with that, I think we should mention not only that we've referenced the book, The Politics of Witness, but Allan has a forthcoming book in our Topical Line Drive series on Wesleyan holiness that I would imagine has a few things to say about living in the message of the cross.
Yeah.
So, Allan, thank you for sharing with us today. I'm looking forward to perhaps sharing with you again. Maybe we can have a conversation on the whole discernment thing, because that's a terribly important subject we only spent about one question on. And so thanks for being with me.
Thank you.
I'm glad you're writing, and all the best in your retirement.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to continuing to work with you.